Well, thank you for coming to this first in our series of 4 presentations on truth and healing. What we hope to accomplish in this series is give us all a chance to learn more about the Native experience from a Native perspective. We have gone through a lot of history, which you may or may not be surprised to find out is a little bit whitewashed. The victors always get to write the history. So what I've done in this presentation is to do some research on some tribal websites. This is amazed that the tribes have websites, but they do, and grab their version of the stories that I'm going to be telling you today. Now, the Native American experience is a part of my family's experience. And I haven't shared this with very many people just because it's not that important to me, except for this it is. You see, I am the 8th great grandson of William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth, of Mayflower fame. And so my family history runs along through the Native American experience. So I want to take you on a journey today from Plymouth Rock to over the Rockies. I want to show you this little picture here. This is the peaceful Patuxent shore where Plymouth Rock is. It's not always that peaceful. If it wasn't sunny and it was windy, I've been there on both kind of days, and the water gets pretty choppy. But the Wampanoag people inhabited the land of Patuxent, which we call Plymouth, and the island of Nuepe, which we call Martha's Vineyard, for at least 12,000 years ago. So the 400 years that have passed since the Mayflower landed there is just a blip in their history. Long before the Mayflower came, French and English fishermen came and trolled the waters off the bay. It was a good fishing area. Some of the ships landed on the island and on the shore to trade with the Wampanoag people. They traded iron tools, copper spoons and kettles, cloth, wool blankets, and many other objects. The natives, in return, gave fur and pelts to the traders so they could take it back to Europe to make hats. Some of the explorers captured indigenous people, and the victims were taken back to Europe, either to be sold as slaves or to be used as a novelty act to take around. Traders also brought something that the indigenous people would have never expected. We call it smallpox. Between 1616 and 1690, there is an estimate that not 50 to 90% of the indigenous people on that coast died from smallpox. Most of the Wampanoag near the Patuxent Bay were wiped out and their village was stranded. So that left a nice unoccupied piece of land with a hill to be able to watch what's coming in for the pilgrims to land on. This is a replica of the Mayflower. It does sit there in the bay, and I've only seen it docked, but it is a very nice thing to see and help us imagine how those guys got here. When the Mayflower cast anchor in the harbor, Wampanoag scouts were quick to watch and find out what they were doing. Several small exploration groups from the Mayflower came ashore to look at the landscape, see what was there, find a place where they could set up a camp. Wampanoag leaders became aware quite quickly that this was a different kind of a group. It seemed that these people did not come to trade with them. When the pilgrims did come ashore, children, and the Wampanoag had never seen that with any landing party. So they figured out pretty quickly, these guys have come to stay. The Wampanoag tolerated their settlement at Patuxent out of practical reasons. Their village of Patuxent had been wiped out by the smallpox plague and abandoned after the epidemic. That left the tribe vulnerable to attack from the Narragansett tribe next door, which were natural rivals. The Wampanoag leaders saw this as an opportunity for protection from the Narragansett and a possible alliance with settlers. Of course, the Pilgrims had their own kind of concerns, because in this strange land, they feared attacks from the Indians. They also had no charter that would give
Well,
them.
Kelvin is talking about the history of
Hi.
Native Americans.
Karen? Karen, would you mute, please? We can hear you. So they had no legal claim to land because they were not coming in the name of King James, nor were they coming in the name of the church. So they had no authority to claim land. By making this kind of an alliance with the indigenous people there, the English felt that entitled them to claim as much land as they could take. Hi, guys. So, the settlers had their first meeting with American Indians in the village of Plymouth, Somerset, who was a representative set by Chief Massasoit, the head of the Wampanoag tribe, on March 16, 1621, the spring after the arrival on Plymouth Rock. He walked into the Plymouth colony very, very confidently, said hello, and in very clear English said, "Welcome, English." He had learned quite a bit of English from the fisher captains who had come ashore, and he got to know all the captains. He could name them by name to the Plymouth colony, and that gave him a lot of credibility. Samoset learned all this English, and it gave him the advantage to be able to represent the tribe with these new people. So the meeting led to a visit from Massasoit himself, the chief, on March 22nd, where they signed a treaty with John Carver, the governor of Plymouth. The treaty basically said this, and this is kind of in its own words, that neither Massasoit nor any of his people should injure or do hurt to any of our people. If any did unjustly war against Massasoit, we would aid him. If anyone did war against us, he would aid us. And so it was a very convenient agreement for both parties. Now, it's important to understand all of these initial treaties with Native Americans meant something different in the eyes of the indigenous people than it did in the eyes of the English. You see, Native Americans at first assumed that we were like them, that we would make good trade partners and good political allies. But to the English, these treaties meant they could take as much land as they could get. And my favorite example of this was the purchase of Manhattan Island. Maybe in grade school, like me, you heard the story that they traded $23 worth of beads and ribbons with the Lenape tribe for the island and any other land that they could capture. The Lenape, believing that the English were like them, assumed that this was a gift in exchange for their permission to use the land. How different is that? But they learned, they all learned. Now, within a month of signing this momentous treaty, Governor John Carver died suddenly, and he had been working out in the field, had a headache, went inside to rest, and a couple days later died. I would guess heat stroke. So this brings in Governor Bradford. The Plymouth settlers selected William Bradford as their new governor, and in that role, he came in and out of office over his lifetime. So it wasn't just a one-term thing. Every once in a while, he would be reelected governor. But that day, the treaty must have weighed heavily on his mind, because in his journal, which has been published for all of us to read, he recorded these words, quote, "If any did unjustly war against Massasoit, we would aid him." that promise must have meant an awful lot to Governor Bradford. Well, the treaty held as a bond of peace between the Wampanoag and the settlers at Plymouth Colony until after the death of Bradford in 1657 and the death of Massasoit in 1662. Excuse me. Now, before I go on with the experience at Plymouth, I'd like to take a little side trip. I want to talk to you about the Iroquois Confederacy, or as they would say, the Haudenosaunee. Now, the reason I want to take this little trip is because their culture and their government and their philosophy, I think, is a pretty good example of that for most indigenous tribes around the country. They're not all alike, they have some different views, but this will give you a flavor of how they approach the world. So this is the map of their nation, and starting from east to west, the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas. The Confederacy was founded by a prophet known by the name of the Peacemaker, and with the help of a warrior named Hiawatha, that may be a more familiar name, they convinced the chiefs to enter into a time of peace. The date of joining of nations is much debated, and it's said to have been from time immemorial. That's pretty much how all indigenous people tell their story. But we've been here as long as anybody can remember. But I have reason to believe that this event happened in the year 1142, and I'll give you a little bit more about that later. It's not just my opinion, there's some research. Well, there was much strife among the Five Nations for years. Not only did they fight with each other, but they fought internally. There was a lot of turmoil, and it was getting so bad, the Creator noticed. And Peacemaker received the great law of peace from the Creator in a dream. The Creator told him to go and spread this word of peace to all the Haudenosaunee people. The great law was given to Hiawatha by the prophet Peacemaker. Now, Peacemaker and Hiawatha traveled around to each tribal chief, imploring them to come together in peace. All of them readily agreed, except for the Onondagas chief. And he was kind of a sorcerer. He had snakes living in his hair, and he had all kinds of magical power. And so Massasoit, Peacemaker and Hiawatha enlisted the help of a holy woman who came in, combed all the snakes out of his hair, and that released him from the spell of the spirits, and he was in his right mind and able to agree to make peace. So the Peacemaker called together 50 tribal chiefs from all of the 5 tribes. Every tribe was to bring a string of wampum beads. They gathered near a tall pine tree, and each tribe pledged not to war with other members of the Confederation and to keep peace among their own tribe. While this was going on, Hiawatha beaded a wampum belt to record this pledge of peace by the 5 tribes. And this is what the belt looks like. Actually, I think it is a picture of the actual belt. So this symbolizes the peace and unity of the 5 tribes. And so again, from east to west, we have the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the tree is the Onondagas, and the Cayugas and the Senecas. The reason that the tree goes to the Onondagas, the tribe where the chief was spiritually so reluctant, is because their tribe is at the center of this confederacy. You see that it's in the middle. And in their longhouse, the place where people lived, it could house, 3, 4, 5 families. But in the center of the longhouse was the fire. And it was the fire that kept safe. It was the fire that helped them have their meals, kept them warm. And as long as the fire was burning, they had peace and safety. And so it makes sense to have this tree in the middle.
You said the tree is the center. Is there a significance, or is it symbolic that the squares, like you got the two little ones on each end and then bigger ones in the center? Or on the,
The squares are all about the same size. It may just be the weave of the belt there.
oh,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they each represent the other four nations. So while holding the wampum belt in his hands, Peacemaker spoke the words of the great law of peace. And while he was speaking, this is almost current events, while he was speaking, there was a total eclipse of the sun.
oh, wow.
And that was taken by a sign as a sign by all of the tribes that the law of peace was to be kept by them forever. So, when did this happen? Based on all the oral tradition, astronomical calculations, archaeological evidence, a date for this founding ceremony is proposed as August 31st, 1142, Common Era, when the event of a total eclipse was calculated. These things are amazing. But we see these kinds of things in our Bible too. And we take those things seriously. And so I respect the stories, the spiritual stories of all of the indigenous. These stories are their 15 chapters of Genesis. Here's how the government was set up. Peacemaker gave the great law of peace to the Haudenosaunee people who formed a grand council. The grand council was made up of 50 chiefs, and they made decisions based on the great law of peace. When decisions are made or laws are passed, they make decisions based on the law of peace, and everyone in the council has to agree in order for it to be accepted. In other words, they had a consensus process of democracy. Now, some of the things of the law of peace are like, you will not war against anyone. You will, if you damage someone's property, you will replace it or repair whatever is done. A whole series of things like this that would be easy for them to resolve any conflicts.
Within their tribe,
Pardon me?
within their.
Within their tribes. Yeah, there were people all around. And that was always a problem too. Today, the Haudenosaunee still continue by these principles for government. And the great law of peace is one of the earliest examples of a democratic country. In fact, it was known to our founding fathers, and Benjamin Franklin took a great deal of interest in their law of peace and spent time with them learning. And so many scholars believe that some of these principles made their way into our Constitution. Now I want to travel back to Plymouth Plantation or Plymouth Colony. I want to tell you about King's Philip War and its impact on America. The war took place between 1675 and 1678. So after the death of Massasoit, his son Metacom became chief of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Metacom was known by the name King Philip among the English, a nickname. He felt that the peace treaty that his father had made was being broken and damaged by the English. See, the settlers continued to encroach on the indigenous land. As their population grew, it's only natural, that you have to spread out into the suburbs, so to speak. The colony leaders also insisted that the Wampanoag surrender all of their weapons based on their peace treaty, because, of course, that would keep peace. Well, Metacom was not going to have anything to do with that. And he refused to agree to this demand. So in response, Metacon led an uprising of the Wampanoag with the Narragansett, the neighboring tribe. And they attacked some women and children, hoping to get a ransom. And they began to fight all around the colony, raiding villages and killing a few people. To fight back, the governor of Plymouth at the time, Josiah Winslow, called out the Plymouth militia, and they organized to move against Metacon's coalition. Now, this became King Philip's army, and they eventually came up against a militia of the Plymouth colony, the Massachusetts Bay colony, and the militia from Connecticut. They were up against a big army. Aware of this risk, the Narragansett decided to sign a treaty of neutrality with the Massachusetts Bay colony in 1675. The Narragansett promised that they would not join King Philip in his war, and that if any of the Wampanoag people sought refuge within their tribe, they would hand them over to the colonists. But colonial forces of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Connecticut became frustrated with the Narragansett because they were not turning over the Wampanoag people and warriors who were taking refuge among them. The colony made an effort to negotiate to get these people from the Narragansett, but the Narragansett would not agree. A few weeks later, they got back together, and all the big guys, if you will, from the Narragansett tribe showed up, including their top warrior. And so they were able to make a peace treaty. But they refused to turn over the Wampanoag who were taking refuge in their villages. So the colonies decided it was time to make war. One of the biggest battles of this war is called the Great Swamp Massacre. This is a little illustration to give you a sense of what that looked like. Their first attack was on the fortified Narragansett village in Rhode Island, in the middle of a great swamp. There was a moat around this fortification, but it was winter, so it had frozen over solid. Major William Bradford, son of Governor Bradford, was the commander of the military forces of the Plymouth colony during King Philip War. He commanded the Plymouth Regiment, consisting of 2 companies that marched on the Narragansett village. The narrative of their attack shows such brutality toward the Narragansetts, which would finally allow the Narragansetts to declare war against the colonies and join King Philip's forces. Their settlement was burned. Its inhabitants, including men and women, were killed or run off. It is believed that 97 Narragansett warriors died and 300 to 1,000 non-combatants, civilians, were killed. The Great Swamp Massacre in history is considered the bloodiest day in the bloodiest war per capita. Of course, there have been bigger wars, but for the number of people involved, it's considered the bloodiest day in the bloodiest war in American history. Well, King Philip's War decimated the Narragansett and the Wampanoag and the other smaller tribes that joined with them, and that paved the way for the colonists to gain more land because it was now vacant. Metacom fled to his secret headquarters in Mount Hope, Rhode Island, and was killed in August of 1676. He was hanged, beheaded, and drawn and quartered in fine English style, I'm sure. His head was placed on a spike and displayed at the Plymouth colony for 2 decades to follow as a warning for anyone who might want to take them on again.
Which was practice at the time.
It was practice at the time.
You can't judge
No,
past by present.
yeah, exactly. And in Britain and in Europe, it was very common.
They did
So
that, white people, everything else.
I couldn't judge them based on that. I would like to now take another detour and talk about the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was a forced displacement of indigenous people. And around 60,000 indigenous people moved between 1830 and 1850. American settlers had been pressuring the federal government to remove the Indians from the southeast. They wanted to move west. And many settlers were encroaching on Indian lands, and of course, that caused conflict. The effort was vehemently opposed by a very famous US Congressman by the name of Congressman Davy Crockett of Tennessee, born on that mountaintop. President Andrew Jackson was able to gain a congressional passage for the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the government to extinguish any claims to land that were held by indigenous tribes in the southeast. The law also authorized the president to designate lands west of the Mississippi for tribal use. That area became known as Indian Territory. And if you're driving through Oklahoma today, you'll see a sign entering the Cherokee Nation. And I've noticed there's not a sign that says leaving the Cherokee Nation. I don't know, but I'll take it seriously. In a legal case called, and Stephanie, I may not be saying this right, in a legal case called Worcester versus Georgia, how I do? Okay, like Worcestershire sauce, I figured, right? 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall held that Georgia did not have the ability to impose a law on a sovereign people. That is the Cherokees. They were a sovereign nation given full rights by our government. And so the Chief Justice ruled they didn't have the authority to make them move. That wouldn't stop President Jackson. He was sympathetic to Georgia's desires to relocate the Native Americans and told them to go ahead. In fact, he is quoted, and I've heard this in a number of places, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. In other words, the president ignored the ruling of the Supreme Court. Now, the US government then began forcing Cherokee off of their native land in 1838. In what became known as the Trail of Tears, some 15,000 Cherokees were driven from their land. And it was done in winter, as you can see. The parties delayed several times until the season changed. Nearly 4,000 American soldiers were sent to escort the Cherokee through this rough land and rivers and pathways of winter. They marched westward on a journey that caused deaths of some 4,000 people. Overall, more than 17,000 indigenous people were forced to make the trek to Oklahoma. Many deaths were the result of starvation, disease, and extreme exposure to the elements.
Now, why did they do that?
To get them out of Georgia so that the colonists could have the land.
That's it. There's also, all these tribes were against the Americans in the Revolutionary War. They fought for the British.
Some did.
That, in the Revolutionary War, all of those tribes, every single one of them fought for the British.
I understand, but what would you
And now in
do?
the War of 1812, the Cherokees did not. They fought for the Americans and they were given that sovereign land. The ones that didn't, well, guess what? After the Revolutionary War, it's no longer you're a colonist, you're an American.
You're Americans.
And what happens to Americans who fight for the other side? That is called treason. There's only one punishment for treason.
But they were separate nations.
Cherokee was.
Let me ask you this. If another country came in and started taking over our land, what would you do?
Well, same thing all our ancestors did.
Same
You
thing
know,
the Native
my
Americans did.
you know, my ancestor side of my mom's family is from northern Germany. Well, guess what? Northern Germany fought the Romans. they made 3 legions disappear. But then along came this guy named Charlemagne and said, hey, you will no longer practice human sacrifice, which they did. And,
Yeah, he killed 900 people in one day.
yeah, he killed a lot of people.
I know Charlemagne.
And Christianity. And for me to go back and say, well, that's not right, I should get this land back, I should have, go back to our living off the land type thing, would be absolutely ridiculous.
And your points are well taken, and I'll be very honest with you. I'm not here to make anyone feel bad about what happened. Not at all.
But I mean, there's reasons
Truth,
between,
oh yeah, but truth and healing is really an effort for us to come together and give up those angers. For example, you're angry that they fought us for wanting to take this land. Well, okay, but do you want to live with that anger forever? That's why we have.
I'm just looking at a whole scenario since then that, we've invested money in the reservations. I work for the FAA right now. We got grants going out to Yin Yang for drone operations in the Choctaw Nation. They're pretty soon gonna be more high tech than anybody in the country.
We won't have any water.
Let me move back to the Bradford family movement. This is intended to depict the country area in Farmersville, New York. At the time when part of my Bradford family moved from Plymouth to Turner, Maine, and then on to upstate New York, where they cleared land to have a farm. And the relations at the time were very friendly with the Native Americans. Wulf Bradford, the daughter of Simon Bradford and Martha True, was born in Turner, Maine, and moved with her parents to Farmersville, New York, still a city today. It was a sparsely settled but heavily wooded territory, and the family began clearing land to make a farm. There, Wulf Bradford met a man named Iris Stearns Hatch, my third great-grandfather. They married in January of 1824, and the newlyweds set up housekeeping and set to clearing land to build a farm. There were many Indian clans there of the Seneca Nation, if you remember them. They are part of that Haudenosaunee Confederacy that I talked about before. They were camped all around Farmersville. There's a family truce between them and the settlers who arrived there. And Weltha and Ira treated the Indians kindly and dealt with them fairly. In fact, Weltha liked to go, when she had free time, over to the camp and listen to the Indians' stories about their origin and their customs. For all her deeply rooted Puritan ancestry, it seemed that Weltha had very little to do with religion. She would say, "No, there are none on earth that agree with my convictions." But some Mormon preachers came through the area, and she liked their message, so she read the Book of Mormon and said, "Now this is for me." What an interesting turn for the great-great-great-great-granddaughter of the great Puritan. She said, "This is what I've finally been looking for." Well, over the next couple of years, both Weltha and Ira converted to Mormonism. They left their farm to Ira's brothers, determined to go west. With their children and most of their possessions loaded into 2 wagons, they headed for Nauvoo, Illinois, which was the jumping off point for the Mormon settlers going to Utah. Unfortunately, Weltha took ill and died a few days later from cholera, which had been going around the encampment there. So Ira took his children and their belongings to Missouri, where the Mormons had a large camp waiting to go west. So now, on to Utah. This is a picture of the Ira Hatch family, not Weltha, she died and he remarried. That would have been taken in Utah. I don't know who's who, because I pulled this off of a kind of an ancestry website. just so, yeah, I said, well, might as well show my family. Ira remarried in 1849 and his family departed to Utah. They found suitable land near a creek and built a log cabin and started farming. Relations there with the nearby American Indians were generally friendly. Sometimes the Native Americans would steal horses and steal cattle, but such infractions were generally overlooked by the Mormons because their leader Brigham Young said, it's cheaper to feed them than it is to fight them. A very practical kind of a proposal. Doesn't always work out the way you'd like. As thousands of more settlers came into the Salt Lake Valley, the Native Americans were pushed further and further away from their hunting grounds and the areas where they foraged for food. Think about it. If you want good farmland, you're gonna pick something where stuff is already growing. And the Native Americans in that area were pretty nomadic. So they depended on picking the wild onions, potatoes, and so forth from that ground. So all of this animosity, if you will, or conflict led to the Black Hawk War of 1865 and 1872. Now, just to give you some idea of the civilization that the Mormons put together, this is the earliest post office in Utah, and it is right in that area where my family had settled. Another thing I just ripped off going from the internet. Now, my great great grandfather, Ephraim Hatch, son of Ira and Welfa, served in the Black Hawk War, fighting against the Northern Ute Indian tribe. Now, as many of you know, I have friends in the Ute tribe, in the Southern Ute tribe, and this medallion was specially made for me by a woman who is part of the Northern Ute tribe in Utah. I remember my mother telling me that they had to fight with Indians, but I kind of forgot it. She didn't know who until I was reading the Ute history, and it talked about the Ute Mormon War, and I thought, oh, they were fighting my friends. Full circle. Life can be strange. Life can be strange. There's providence everywhere we look. The Ute bands in the Utah Central Valley were pushed out of traditional hunting areas and the foraging areas by Mormon towns and farms. This resulted in some of the bands starving and unable to feed their people. Ute leaders, especially Chief Black Hawk, realized that within a few years, their way of life would be no more. To them, creating reservations was a death sentence because it took away their culture. It took away their style of living, of hunting and foraging, and being together in great unity. The families were all very close. Chief Black Hawk watched with tears as people became increasingly starved and sick. He cried as their death toll continued to grow. Tribes were usually given the least habitable land when land was selected for the reservations, making livestock and agriculture almost impossible. And the reservations do not belong to the tribe that occupied them. They are held in trust by the United States government. So the land really belongs to the federal government. They don't have the opportunity to own it.
Otherwise, they wouldn't be Americans. They'd be-
Well, they are sovereign nations too, by the way. They have their own government, their own laws, and they're recognized by the United States as a sovereign nation. Now, the killing of 70 of Black Hawk's relatives in 1850, which included beheading them at Fort Utah, angered the chief and his people. An act of Congress in 1864 required Utes to give up title and rights to all their land and move to the Uinta Reservation within a year. It was a shorter trail of tears, but I've read accounts from descendants that said they cried all the way to this reservation.
Were they given
These-
an opportunity like some of the Choctaw? They were allowed to stay where they're at and just become like everybody else?
No. They were moved to a reservation as they were in Colorado. The Ute occupied all the territory, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico and Wyoming part.
But I mean, they,
And so in 10 years after the settlers arrived here, they had driven all of the Ute people in the state of Colorado to a 15-mile band at the border of New Mexico. And that's all the land they got to occupy. They had no choice. Treaties were broken. They had more land. When gold was found, guess what? You gotta go away from here.
that's if they wanted to
We,
stay as a
sir.
tribe, yes.
We, sir, and I say this honestly, we white people are greedy. These are many of the events on both sides of the Black Hawk War that ignited the battle. The years of 1865 to 1867 were by far the most bitter parts of this war. In the fall of 1867, Chief Black Hawk made a peace treaty with the Mormons because he could see that it was very soon that his band of warriors were not going to be able to stay together. Intermittent raiding and killing by the Ute tribe continued until 1872. No, they were not the kindest of people, but 200 federal troops coming into the area to stop them from these raids. Everything ended immediately, and there was peace. Now we get on to, I think, your point, called Manifest Destiny. I love this painting because it depicts Columbia coming across the country with the laws of the Republic in her hand and stringing some telegraph wire with the other. She was an industrious lady. That's, women have to do that. I mean, you've all had kids or some of you have, but, the phrase Manifest Destiny was coined in 1845 by a newspaper editor named John O'Sullivan. This iconic painting, called American Progress by John Gast in 1872, I think is a great allegorical representation of our move to the West. Columbia, the female in the figure, leads Americans to the West and into the future by carrying the values, the book in her hand, and as she's stringing wire for the telegraphs, and progress is shown through the inclusion of technological innovations like trains. And the clearing of native peoples and animals is seen pushing them into the darkness. The buffalo were killed mainly to eliminate food for the Native Americans. Sure, they were in the way of development. Sure, they were in the way of the railroad. But the unspoken policy was kill the bison and you'll kill the Indians. Killing for the bison was just considered a part of this obvious destiny. Factors drove killing off the bison included the competition for the Continental Railroad, improvements in tanning technology made bison hides valuable. They were very useful in making the belts that were used in wood lumber mills because they had a steam engine and everything in the plant ran off of these belts. Encouragement by the US Army that eliminating the bison would help their efforts to force American Indians into reservations. It was a way of saying that Americans were moving westward and living the dream. Now I'll talk about the Battle of Little Bighorn. I think we've all heard the story, how General Custer was ambushed by all these Indians, and he and his soldiers were wiped out. The Battle of Little Bighorn took place in June 25th and 26th of 1876 in south central Montana. It was fought along the ridges of the steep bluffs and ravines of the Little Bighorn River. The fighting was between the US Army and American Indians, including the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho. In 1868, fierce fighting between the US Army and Lakota Cheyenne warriors led to several Lakota leaders sign a treaty of Fort Laramie. This treaty created a large reservation in South Dakota, which was the beloved land of the Black Hills that was so important and sacred to the Lakota people. And also that the government would provide some subsidies. But Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, the two main chiefs, would have nothing to do with that. They refused to go onto the reservations, and they lived in the hills surrounding the Little Bighorn Valley. They felt no obligation to conform to these restrictions, and they refused to limit their hunting to territories that were assigned them by the government. After gold was discovered in South Dakota's Black Hills in 1875, the US Army ignored provisions of the agreements and invaded the region. This betrayal led many Sioux and Cheyenne tribesmen to leave their reservations and join Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse in Montana. By the late spring of 1876, more than 10,000 Native Americans were living on the ridge over the Little Bighorn Valley. They were there in defiance of the US government orders to be on the reservation, and so they were ordered back to the reservation. On the morning of June 25th, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer Armstrong drew camp near the valley of the Little Bighorn. The next day, he decided that he would press on with his 200 or 300 troops rather than wait for reinforcement. At midday on June 25th, 600 men entered the Little Bighorn Valley. Word spread quickly in the hills among the Native Americans that he and his troops were there. Older Sitting Bull rallied his warriors, and Crazy Horse set off with a large force to meet the attackers head on. Well, despite Custer's desperate efforts and attempts to regroup his men, they were quickly overwhelmed. Custer and some 200 in his battalion were attacked, and by as many as 3,000 warriors. Within an hour, Custer's forces were defeated. The Battle of Little Bighorn, also called Custer's Last Stand, is marked as one of the most decisive Native American victories and the worst defeat along the plains of the Indian War. Now, I'm going to throw a little note out to you. One of our speakers, not me, it could either be Ingrid or it could be Stephanie, is related, I understand, to George Custer. But you have to come to the presentations and you want to find out. I'm not telling.
And they were mutilated.
That's true. Now, Indian boarding school. Beginning with the Indian Civilization Act Fund of 1819 and the Peace Policy of 1869, the United States adopted the Indian boarding school policy, urging by several denominations of Christian churches. I understand that there was one Lutheran church somewhere in Minnesota that took advantage of this and started a school under the federal act. And I understand 4 others were started independently by church. And there's a group of volunteers in Minnesota right now combing through all those records to discover what happened there. This is all part of the ELCA's Truth and Healing process. Between 1869 and the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of Native American children were removed from their homes and their families and placed in boarding schools around the country. There were more than 523 of these government-funded schools and other church-run Indian boarding schools across the United States. Indian children were forcibly taken by government agents from their parents, and parents who resisted were told they could be put in jail if they didn't comply. They were sent to schools hundreds of miles away where they were beaten, starved, and otherwise abused when they spoke their native languages. They were to speak English. Now I want to show you a map of all of these boarding schools around the country. And I saw this map for the first time watching a webinar on boarding schools. And if you see these two clusters right here, I asked why those two clusters. Well, the anthropologist in the anthropologist in the presentation said it's because that's where the Native American reservations were. My friend Garrett Briggs, a Ute who is also an archaeologist, said, and there were railroad lines that could be used to transport children there, which is where Hitler got the idea of putting Jews into boxcars and moving them off to Auschwitz. The children suffered physical and sexual and cultural abuse and neglect for speaking their native languages, and many children never returned home, and their fates are still not known by their families. One former student recounted, and this is typical. I've done a lot of research into.
Well, where'd you get
the
that
boarding
Hitler
schools.
thing?
It's in his history. I didn't make
Pretty
it
well
up.
documented, Ron.
It's- yeah.
I mean, got it from this.
The Native American.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
It's-
yeah.
it's in his
Different
history.
ideas
The
from
Germans
American.
studied the
I
US.
have- I have not made up the
Black
word.
And Native Americans to see how they would implement their policies,
Yeah,
absolutely.
he wrote about it, that inspired him.
So the Carlisle School was the first Indian boarding school in the country. It was opened in 1879 and operated for nearly 30 years with the mission to kill the Indian and save the man. Opened in 1879 in Pennsylvania, the Carlisle Indian School was the first government-run boarding school that was off the reservation for Native Americans. A Civil War veteran, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, spearheaded the effort to create these schools around the country. Pratt believed that there was only one hope for Native American survival was to shed all of their native cultures and custom and assimilate fully into the white American culture. His common refrain was kill the Indian and save the man. And that was the mantra of the entire boarding school movement. The Carlisle Indian School became the template for 300 schools around the country that followed the establishment of the Carlisle School. While Carlisle was in operation, close to 200 children from 59 different tribes died there. Many died of diseases made worse by poor living conditions and abuse, and buried in school cemeteries. It occurs to me a school should not have a cemetery, but they were sent there for life. Carlisle School closed in 1918, but its legacy still continues as it was the model for all of the other boarding schools. Now, something a little closer to home, the Sand Creek Massacre happened just 50 miles east of here.
They ever say, like, once the kids got old enough that actually made it through, like 18 or something like that, what happened to the kids once they got to adult age, let's say?
Once they were 18, they could leave.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just kind of turn loose and
Yeah, but a lot of them,
Americanized by then.
a lot of them never came back. When they returned to their tribal land, they took up the culture again.
So they tried to Americanize them, like put them in a boarding school.
The morning of November 29th, 1864, around 750 people from the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes were encamped at the Big Sandy Creek Bend. It was 40 miles north of Fort Lyon. The Treaty of Fort Laramie began the process of limiting how much land the Native Americans could hold on the Great Plains. It was this encampment of Big Sandy Creek of Arapaho and Cheyenne people who were hoping to find peace there between their nations and the white settlers. A proclamation was sent out at the beginning of the summer of 1864 by the governor of the territory of Colorado, John Evans, who commanded all friendly Native Americans of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes to go to Fort Lyon and receive supplies and find safety. Unfortunately, this conflicted with a standing order at all forts within the territory of Colorado that all members of the military should shoot any Indian approaching a fort and kill any American Indian who was anywhere around the fort. Responding to this order, Chief Black Kettle of the Cheyenne tribe took steps to negotiate peace. He contacted Major Wynkoop at Fort Lyon, and they went to talk with the governor and one of the main generals to try and negotiate peace. Their initial effort failed. But until peace was settled, Chief Kettle was fearful that their people were subject to violence by the American military. Despite the efforts of Major Wynkoop, both Governor Evans and Colonel Covington refused to negotiate peace with the Indians. At the command of the American military, Chief Black Kettle settled his people at the bend of the Big Sandy River. This encampment of women and children and elderly was prepared to move to Fort Lyon at the moment's notice, were they to find safety and supplies from the American military. In other words, if they had peace. On a cold November morning, Colonel Covington and elements of the 1st Colorado Infantry Regiment of Volunteers, the 3rd Regiment Colorado Cavalry Volunteers, arrived at the southwest of the Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment. Colonel Covington was never given orders to leave Denver, but at around 6:30 a.m., the soldiers opened fire on the teepees of the innocent Arapaho and Cheyenne people. They were told that if they put an American flag and a white flag on a stand, the military would not attack them. So over the course of 8 hours, the American troops killed around 250 Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly women and children, and the elderly members in their tribe. 13 Cheyenne chiefs and 1 Arapaho chief was killed. During the afternoon of the following day, soldiers wandered over the killing fields, collecting trinkets and pieces that they wanted to take home, sometimes taking scalps, before leaving the scene on December 21st. And I'm just about done. We're just about on time. My home story. I want to jump over the Rockies a little further, the San Joaquin Valley of California, where I've told you about my grandfather's settlement. My grandfather began purchasing land in Fresno County, west of the city of Fresno, in the early 1900s. Many thousands of years before my grandfather began acquiring land, that area was the ancestral home of the Yocut tribe. It's estimated that the Yokuts in Fresno County at the time of a European encounter was about 70,000. Eventually, California state militia would go on war against the Yokuts and other tribes in what has become known as the California Genocide. The Yokut population was reduced to around 5,000 souls between 1850 and 1900. Many of the survivors were either forced into indentured servitude or killed. It does not escape me that where my grandfather built the house where I grew up, that land provided my food, my clothing, and a really good Berkeley education. But it does not escape me that land was made available on the blood of the Yokut people.
How many were to begin with?
70,000.
And how many white people were around at the time?
Not that many. It was all done by the militia. So one last thought. I think I can get done with this and get you out of here. Red Jacket was chief of the Seneca tribe, and he was a great orator at the time. The tribe was approached by some missionaries who wanted permission to come onto the land, and he gave them an oral answer. This is just one part of it. I think I put Stephanie to sleep when I read her the whole thing, so I figured I'll take an excerpt. I want to read this from a speech given by Red Jacket in 1805. Brother, listen to what I say. There was a time when our forefathers owned this great island. Their seats extended from the rising of the sun to the setting of the sun. The Great Spirit had made it ours for the use of Indians. He created the buffalo, the deer, and other animals for food. He made the bear and the beaver, and their skins served us for clothing. He had scattered them over the country and taught us how to take them. He had caused the earth to produce corn and bread. All of this he had done for his red children because the Creator loved them. If we had any disputes about hunting grounds, they were generally settled without shedding of blood. But an evil day came upon us. Your forefathers crossed the great waters and landed on this island. Their numbers were small. They found friends, not enemies. They told us they had fled from their own country for fear of wicked men and came here to enjoy their religion. They asked for a small seat. We took pity on them and granted their request. And they sat down amongst us, and we gave them corn and meat. They gave us poison in return. The white people had now found our country. Tidings were carried back, and more came amongst us. Yet we did not fear them. We took them to be friends, and they called us brothers. We believed them, and we gave them a larger seat. At length, their numbers had greatly increased, and they wanted more land. They wanted our country. Our eyes were open, and our minds became uneasy. Wars took place, and Indians were hired to fight against Indians, and many of our people were destroyed. They also brought strong liquor among us. It was strong and powerful, and caused the death of thousands. To the Native Americans, this is our legacy. And as I say, I'm not here to accuse anybody. This is what happened. This is history. And colonists all over the world came in and claimed land. But between the white people and the Native American people, there are feelings to resolve. Some of us have anger at the slaughtering they did. Some of us feel bad to realize we took their land. I'm just now beginning to think about what my heritage with the Bradford family means to me. This research was all in the head. Now I got to deal with it in the heart.